I'm Andrew Schwartz, and you're listening to The Truth of the Matter, a podcast by CSIS where we break down the top policy issues of the day and talk with the people that can help us best understand what's really going on. To get to the truth of the matter about U.S. strategic competition with China, we have our newest member of CSIS, Dr. Tom Christensen, who is the new Pritzker Chair in geopolitics. Tom was a senior official in the George Bush administration. He is also a professor of public and international affairs and director of the China and the World program at Columbia University's School of International Public Affairs. Tom, welcome to CSIS. We're really glad to have you.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So you were in the Bush administration, and one of the people who was working in China policy, you worked on the administration's responsible stakeholder strategy. That's what you all called it regarding China. How far are we from that today? All we're talking about today is strategic competition, not necessarily responsible stakeholder stuff.
Well, that's a great question. I think that responsible stakeholder as a strategy is widely misunderstood. It was based on a speech given by Deputy Secretary Robert Zoellick in 2005. And I think people misread that speech, or they misremember the speech in the sense that they think it was a descriptive effort at talking about U.S.-China relations, whereas what it was aspirational. It was inviting China to play this role if it were willing to do so. I don't think there was a lot of naivete about how far China was going to go along that road, but we thought it was useful in the administration to invite China to play that role because China had so much influence in the world, and the Clinton administration had invited China to get integrated with the international economy and with the international multilateral institutions that existed. But our impression was that China was not pulling its weight in maintaining the international order from which China was benefiting. So we're inviting China to play a more constructive and proactive role. And there were various aspects of that strategy that paid off in some places. But it's been described as a kind of naive description of U.S.-China relations when it was never meant to be. And people contrast it to strategic competition. And I don't think that that's a really fair comparison in the sense that the strategy at the time had a competitive element to it. We were already in a strategic competition. We didn't talk about it.
You just weren't calling it that.
We didn't talk about it at the end of every meeting with the Chinese. We didn't think that that was a necessary form of our diplomacy. But if you look at, especially at the military sphere, most of the defense aspects of what will be associated with the Obama administration's pivot to Asia really began at the same time that that speech was given under Robert Zoellick. The moving of naval assets and air assets, a larger percentage of them, to the Asia-Pacific theater to respond to China's impressive military modernization. And the other aspect of that was that we had very robust arms sales offers online with Taiwan at the time. And even at times when we were criticizing the Taiwan leadership during that second term of the Bush administration because of various initiatives that they were undertaking that we saw as destabilizing, we were offering them relatively large arms packages for the long run because we saw where China's military modernization was going. We took it seriously. It's just that we didn't frame the relationship on strategic competition. And I think there were reasons not to do so. I do believe we're in a strategic competition. I believe it's fine to describe it that way analytically, but if it's a competition and it's purely a strategic competition, then what's the goal? What's the endpoint?
I mean, that's the great question, right?
Yeah. What's the endpoint? And we had goals. They weren't descriptive. They were aspirational. But right now, I'm a little bit concerned if we just say we're in a strategic competition and it's open-ended, it's easy to roll back into a position where it becomes a zero-sum proposition, where anything good for China is bad for the United States and vice versa. And I think our relationship is still, even today, much more complicated than that.
So tell me, what should we be thinking about in terms of this strategic competition that we're maybe not thinking about and that we're not talking about?
We talk about it. Whether we execute maximally efficiently on those scores is another matter. And that is the greatest advantage we've had for decades over China in the strategic competition in which we've been engaged is our alliances and partnerships. We have 60-plus allies and partners in the region and outside the region, and we coordinate with those actors, and that's a huge advantage that we have over China. And I'm concerned that we don't always manage those alliances and partnerships in the best way that we can, and therefore use that lever effectively against China. I'm concerned now that some of our economic policies may do harm to our alliances and partnerships at a very sensitive time, new administration. And I think the new administration has said it wants to focus on strategic competition. I take heart in that. It has said that the alliances and partnerships will be important. I take heart in that. But I'm concerned that some of the economic policies in particular may undercut the support for the United States in the ally and partner countries and regions, and that might make it more difficult for us to execute our competitive strategy. And on the military side, there's one aspect of U.S. strategy that's been changing over time, over the last couple of administrations, Trump 1.0 and the Biden administration, and that is that the United States requires in East Asia to project power a more diversified, mobile, and distributed force, which means we need access to new places in allied and partner territories and countries, and that's very controversial in the domestic politics of those areas. So even in a very close ally like Japan, we need access to new places, and local populations are not always thrilled about that prospect. So we need to manage on the political level those relationships very carefully. South Korea is going through a political transition. They're a close ally, so we need to be sensitive to their domestic politics. And one of my concerns is that our proposed tariffs against these economies that's already hit in the automotive sector and promises to hit harder after the 90-day halt on the Liberation Day tariffs.
I mean, there's an awful lot of Japanese and Korean cars in America on the roads.
Sure. Yeah, it's very popular. Some of them are made here, so they wouldn't. But even there, they import parts.
Yes.
So the parts would become more expensive. And again, it feeds into domestic politics where you're trying to do new things with allies and partners that are potentially controversial. And at the same time, there's friction on the economic front. And I would like to see the security piece, which has been laid out well, that we see the rise of China as a real challenge in the security front. We need to compete strategically. I get all that and I support it. I would like to see that integrated more closely with our economic policies because if they're not, there's a chance that the frictions, political frictions created by the economic strategies could undercut support for some of the things we need to do in the defense sector.
What else can we do to assure our allies, short of ending these tariffs, making it more economically viable for them? What else can we do?
I think the way we manage burden sharing is also important. I give the Trump administration's first term credit for getting the Europeans to spend more on their defense, which I think is important. I expect Asian allies and partners to spend more on defense, but I think that they should have a stronger sense of the strength and endurance of the alliance relationships that we have. And one of the places where I believe our strategy in the region, our competitive strategy with China in the region has suffered is the reversal of our policy on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, where allies and partners in East Asia are a bit shocked by our treatment of Ukraine.
Yeah.
And that...
Because it has second and third order consequences for how they view us.
Right. So that there's that directly, how they view us, how reliable is the United States. And there have been recent public opinion research done in South Korea and in Taiwan. And the degree to which the publics there believe the United States will come to their defense has plummeted as a result of these policies in Russia and Ukraine. And there's a second piece, which is the Biden administration did a good job of strengthening U.S. alliances in East Asia during their 4 years in office. But they also did something else, which is to not just strengthen the U.S. relationship with NATO allies, largely assisted by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but they got the Northeast Asian countries in particular, the Japanese and the South Koreans, to cooperate with each other, which is something extraordinary, something that administration after administration had wanted to see, but also to get South Korea and Japan cooperating with NATO allies. And the South Korean and Japanese leaders would attend NATO conferences. The NATO allies were setting up offices in Northeast Asia to communicate with these countries. And this is important. The links between Europe and Asia are important for U.S. deterrence in Asia in the following sense, that European countries are unlikely to project significant military power in a crisis or conflict into East Asia. But they're very important economically to the East Asian nations, especially China. And the prospect for China that using force could lead not only to a military response by the target of that use of force and the United States and maybe one or two other allies, but also a response in the economic sphere by Northeast Asians and Europeans, really was a major force for dissuasion, preventing the use of force. And I'm afraid now that with the treatment of Ukraine and the effort to kind of separate the two alliance systems in the way that U.S. strategists talk about international security politics, makes the prospect of that kind of economic punishment of China over the use of force seem much less real. And I also think that the tariffs on the Europeans and the East Asians could make it harder for the United States to rally countries in the future to raise economic sanctions against China over the use of force. If the Chinese know that in real time at time zero in peacetime and they sense that, then it concerns me that they may be emboldened.
Right. And so along those lines, I wanted to ask you, Tom, do the Indo-Pacific allies and partners welcome a singular focus on China competition and maybe fewer resources spent on support for NATO and Ukraine? Or is it really they're looking at NATO and Ukraine as a harbinger for them, as you just described?
Yeah, I think it's more complicated than they'd be relieved that we're focusing on China or on East Asia. I know for sure from discussing things with Taiwan elites that they were very supportive of Ukraine in the war against Russia because they saw it as an example of something. They saw it as something that showed that the United States and the Europeans would support a democracy against an authoritarian attack. And they were big supporters of U.S. support for Ukraine, pretty much across the political spectrum and in Taiwan. So there is a kinetic logic, there's a kind of physics logic that says if the U.S. is expending its limited munitions in support of Ukraine or its limited defense dollars in support of Ukraine, there'll be fewer weapons and defense dollars for a place like Taiwan. That makes sense. It holds
Sure.
together logically. But morale is such an important part of deterrence.
And perception.
And perception. So if the people in Taiwan want us to support Ukraine, it seems like a bad bet to reduce the support for Ukraine in order to support Taiwan's defense, because there's been study after study in Taiwan that morale in Taiwan and the willingness to stand up for their own defense is directly related to how reliable they find the United States. And if they see us in Taiwan as having sold out Ukraine, then the reliability of the United States gets called into question. And then the number of weapons that we transfer to Taiwan may not be as important as the loss in morale that we had. And the same goes for South Korea and Japan. One of the reasons that, there were several reasons, but one of the reasons they were able to get over their historical allergy to cooperating with each other and the United States together in a trilateral format that was a real breakthrough for the Biden administration at the Camp David meetings, was that both of those countries were spooked not only by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but by the Chinese reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is Chinese support for Russia when there was a clear violation of sovereignty against a democratic country. One of the reasons they said we have to get over this historical friction is that. So again, Ukraine was kind of at the center of their security calculations. And again, I think they're kind of shocked at the change in our policy towards Ukraine. And yes, does it free up more potential resources for the Asian theater, which I think is important, and I support some of the buildup in our weapons manufacturing that's been envisioned, because we need more weapons in the theater.
More ships, too.
We need more ships, and we need more long-range strike weapons, and we need to have them deployed in the theater so that they're available in a timely fashion for deterrence. I get all that, and I realize that there are a limited number of dollars in the world, but I think we've done some real harm to our greatest strength in the competition with China, which is our allies and partnerships. by our policy towards Ukraine, even though Ukraine is very distant from the theater, and even though, yes, the United States was expending significant resources in support of Ukraine.
Right, because they're watching closely. We know that. Tom, I want to move on to something else that's pretty contentious, and that's tariffs.
Yeah.
The United States and China are really going at it. If these tariffs are sustained, how important would high U.S. tariffs on China be to the Chinese economy? I host another podcast called The Trade Guys, and we talk about this all the time. I'm really interested to know what kind of impact you think this is going to have on the Chinese people and their economy.
Yeah, well, I don't want to give you the weak answer that you probably heard from lots of your interlocutors that it depends, but it does depend. And I've listened to those podcasts. They're excellent, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
They're really excellent. So right now, it's hard to predict what level the tariffs will be. We have the 90-day hiatus. They're still quite high.
Very high.
Yeah, as your last podcast laid out, there's the 30% that people talk about, but there were pre-existing tariffs in addition. So it could be higher. It's really hard to suss out, but it could be lower than it would be if the 90 days passes or will be if the 90 days pass and we have an increase. There are various signals that come out. They're not always in the same direction about where that will go. If the Chinese lose the U.S. market, as they would have if we stayed at 135%, then that would be very damaging to the Chinese economy. China has tried to prepare for this in their economic strategies, both in terms of what they do at home and whom they rely on and where they sell products abroad. But exports are important to the Chinese economy. They've been more important in the last couple of years than they were before. China's not totally export dependent. I think that's been somewhat exaggerated in people's discussions, but they do have some very labor-intensive industries that rely on the U.S. market, so they will lose a lot of jobs.
And is it more important because their housing market's been crashing as well?
Yeah, so they've relied in the last couple of years on exports for growth more than they did in the previous years, in part because they've had trouble generating domestic consumption as a driver of their growth. And one of the reasons that they've had trouble generating domestic consumption as a driver of growth is that the real estate sector has been in the tank. It seems to be recovering somewhat. But that's because Chinese families, especially urban families, often have a lot of their savings wrapped up in real estate. So if your major assets are shrinking in value, you become more conservative in how you spend.
So they're not buying their own stuff, and therefore the exports are even more important.
Yeah, and what happened in 2024 was really extraordinary. China had a $1 trillion plus trade surplus with the world, which is a record.
It's huge.
Yeah, it's huge, and it's unsustainable. And I think one thing that both Chinese experts, I'm not an economist, I'm not going to pretend to be an economist. You have very good economists on your show, and I've listened to them and I learned from them. But both Chinese experts and foreign experts agree that China needs to have a more consumption-driven economy for the long run. I think they also agree, although it's harder to get Chinese experts to say this out loud, that the 2024 strategy is unsustainable, that the world can't absorb all these things. So when I said it depends before about how much the U.S. tariff system will affect China's economy, one of the big questions is, will the United States use its tariff leverage over third countries to get them to alter their own economic relationship with China? I think China can probably absorb the U.S. tariffs. A lot of jobs will be lost, and they have an unemployment problem already, and that will make it worse. It will not be a pleasant time for China. But if the United States can get a country like Vietnam or Mexico or other countries to reduce their own cooperation with China economically, then it becomes a much bigger deal for the Chinese economy. Because the Chinese economy entire growth model is not as export dependent as it's sometimes portrayed, but it's about 20% of their GDP. And so what happened after 2018 is very instructive. That's when the U.S. first round of U.S. tariffs, serious ones, went into effect. Predictably, and I can say that because I predicted it, the United States continued to consume almost as many Chinese products in terms of value as they did before the tariffs. As a percentage of the United States' overall trade deficit with the world, China's contribution to that shrunk over time. But the United States deficit with Vietnam, the United States deficit with Mexico skyrocketed. So in the case of Vietnam, it went from $35 billion a year in 2018 to $125 billion a year last year. And the case of Mexico, it went from $80 billion a year in 2018 to $180 billion in 2024. And a lot of the content of those imports from those countries were intermediate products being sold to China for final assembly in those places. And a lot of those companies weren't all Chinese. And this is the really complicated thing that gets back to your excellent questions on alliances and partnerships. I was in Vietnam last year. I went to 11 countries last year while I was on leave. I went to Vietnam, and the Vietnamese, this is before the November 24 election, were already nervous about protectionism in the United States and where it might go. And one of the reasons they're concerned is a company like Samsung, the Korean phone company, used to make their phones in China. They now make over 80% of their phones in Vietnam. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the parts that go into those phones come from China. So a lot of the value comes from China, and then it comes back out to the American consumer. And of course, the Vietnamese are worried about getting caught up in that. So when I said before, it depends. Can the United States get countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, Bangladesh, Mexico to reduce their cooperation with China because of the threat of having the U.S. market closed off to them? Perhaps. I think it's a hard bet because those countries depend very heavily on their good relations with China. So if all the pieces fell into place, the Chinese economy could be severely harmed. But I think it's going to be very difficult to achieve distancing of the Vietnamese economy from the Chinese economy in a systemic way.
It's really interesting in the leverage that China has over the United States and the leverage that we're developing and we have over them as well. And the, New York Times is writing about, well, hey, our car manufacturers are running out of magnets. They all come from China, which also means our jet fighter pilots may not have things to fly anymore because they also use those magnets for that and a host of other things. Interesting to see the leverage going back and forth. I guess the question I have for you is, we always think of Xi Jinping as being this ultimate authoritarian, having a complete grip on the people of China. Does some of this call his leadership into question?
I think that, Xi Jinping is a leader of a Leninist organization, and I think those types of organizations always worry about domestic stability. We as outsiders can see a very strong leader without a clear rival, but it is kind of in the DNA of a Leninist party to worry about domestic instability. And one of the areas where they worry about domestic instability is people's frustration with their economic prospects. So I think it is a challenge if the Chinese economy turns down because of these international events. But I don't see in the near term any kind of political rival to Xi Jinping. Does he likely worry about job loss? Does he likely worry about youth unemployment, which already exists in China? Does he worry about the real estate sector? I can say with some certainty that he does, because that's how these people roll. They worry about their domestic situation. Chinese Communist Party security is PRC security job 1, 2, and 3. And so, yeah, they'll be concerned about it. Can the United States, through tariff policy, change Chinese domestic politics? I have my strong doubts. Would they worry about those results? It's quite possible. And to get back to our alliances and partnerships, if all of these countries are part of a transnational production chain, and that's really what's different in East Asia than interdependence before World War I and elsewhere. They're part of a transnational production chain where Chinese parts are being assembled into final products and being sent around the world. Then they're going to be very concerned about U.S. tariffs on China, particularly if they're followed by something that could happen over time, which is inspection of imports from various countries other than China to determine the amount of Chinese value that's in the final product.
So these are the workaround issues.
So the workaround issue, it's on people's radar screen. I think the Trump administration people are aware of this. They understand the problem, so they're onto it. It's just very complicated to determine that. And it'll be very abrasive, or it could create real friction in the relationships with the countries that are exporting to the United States and being subjected to this kind of import surveillance by the United States. And that could cause real friction with a country like South Korea. So South Korea has two potential problems. One is the products they make in South Korea. A lot of the cars that they make in South Korea import significant products from China, including the materials related to rare earths. and they're already being hit with automobile tariffs that are high. If in addition they get hit with higher tariffs because they have Chinese parts to their cars, they'll be concerned. And I've heard that concern last year when I was in South Korea. I think it's true of Japan as well. And it's certainly true in the case of a Korean company like Samsung that's making lots of products in a place like Vietnam. There's 46% tariffs online for Vietnam. If the 90-day hiatus doesn't produce a positive result, that would be very damaging to those South Korean companies, those Japanese companies, and American companies that have moved final production to places like Vietnam out of China. Some of that started before all of this. Some of that started just because Chinese labor was becoming more expensive and people were moving to places with lower cost labor. But I think a lot of it was accelerated by the 2018 tariffs and by the fear of future tariffs.
Yeah, and the continuation of the Biden administration with tariffs as well.
Yeah, they didn't lower them at all. I mean, candidate Joe Biden ran against the tariffs, said that they were worse for the American consumer than they were worth, but he kept them in place. And he added some along the way.
Tom, this is a great welcome to CSIS. Fascinating conversation. Can't thank you enough, and really am looking forward to many more conversations like this.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts.